From fiery parliamentary debates to the streets of South Africa, the discussion about South Africa's constitution is heating up like never before. Is South Africa's constitution the democratic gift that keeps on giving? Or is it beginning to show cracks in its edifice? Let's get into it. Spread the fire, welcome back to SMWX, and in today's episode, I want to take a step back from the political theatre of the day and have a look at this debate that is raging about South Africa's constitution. Now, we've had the MK party, for example, making a radical call for the constitution effectively to be scrapped and for a new system of parliamentary sovereignty to be brought into South Africa. On the other hand, we have defenders of the constitution from the ANC to the DA making up the vast majority of parliament, saying that this governing coalition is united by the glory of the constitution. Now, with this debate, and of course it's a debate that's been raging for a lot longer in South African history, I want to help you understand what the constitution itself is, what does it say, and how we can make sense of this debate so that we can understand the constitutional debate in more depth and more detail. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts. Firstly, I want to just establish for you what the constitution is, what it says, because it's actually not clear, and a lot of people talk about the constitution but have never actually read it. Secondly, I want to talk about what are some of the legitimate gains and successes that have been made through the constitution in South Africa. And then finally, I want to talk about some of the failures or at least areas of ambiguity around the constitution, and ultimately want to defend a position of mixed feelings on the constitution. In some ways, it's an incredible advance, a brilliant document that takes South Africa forward. But in other ways, there are challenges and problems that we need to be honest about and confront. And I think the debate on the Constitution has been too binary. You either hate it or you love it. You want to scrap it in its entirety or you want to keep it exactly as it is. And ultimately, my view is that we need a debate on the Constitution which acknowledges its virtues and also its vices. So having said that, there's this debate in the Constitution or in constitutional scholarship which puts people into different categories. I had a really interesting interview with Dr. Ndando Sindane, a legal scholar at the University of the Western Cape on this. And I think you can think of the categories in 3. Abolitionists, who want to scrap the Constitution and start from the beginning. Skeptics, who don't really know whether the Constitution should stay or go. They have a problem with some of it, but not all of it. And triumphalists who think that it's perfect and it's God's gift to the earth, right? But I want to create a different kind of position. A triumphalist, skeptical, abolitionist position. In other words, all of these positions in some ways take a view on the entire document, whereas I think there is reason to be triumphalist about some things, there is reason to be skeptical about other things, and there's even reason to be abolitionist about other things. And so I want to be a triumphalist, skeptical abolitionist at the moment and say that all of these different schools of thought actually have something to commend them, but using broad brushstrokes over the Constitution is also unhelpful, whether those broad brushstrokes are positive or negative. So, having said that and having laid the land, let's have a look at what the Constitution actually is. When politicians invoke the Constitution, you get a certain sense of, you get these feelings, you get an image in your mind, but what is that image? How does that relate to the actual reality of the document and the text? If I were to ask you right now, what is Chapter 10 of the Constitution about? Would you actually know? Have you ever even read the document? Be honest. If I said Chapter 3, Would you know? How many chapters does the Constitution even have? Okay, don't worry. It's just you and I, so you don't have to admit this. But see how when you actually get to specifics about the Constitution, it's actually not as easy as we might think. I think Chapter 10 is about public administration, and Chapter 3 is cooperative governance. And the Constitution has 14 chapters, by the way. Okay, so let's look at this document, right? What is the Constitution? What does it seek to do? Well, I think most constitutional textbooks or texts on the Constitution are correct when they say the Constitution tries to serve two distinct functions. The first thing it tries to do is create a set of values that underpin a democratic society, or if it's not democratic, then it won't be a democratic society, but in our case, it is democratic. So it creates a set of founding values, a set of founding propositions or claims that the entire society rests on. It creates, in some ways, a vision for that society that unites the society, so that even if political parties disagree on one thing or the other, the values of the Constitution remain sacrosanct. And our Constitution does that. But that's not all the Constitution does. In fact, this is what most people think the Constitution is. It's just the values. But the second thing is maybe even more important. Because once you create that vision for the society, or that underlying set of values, then you have to design a country on top of those values. And the vast majority of the Constitution is actually designing the country after setting the values. So when I say designing the country, what do I mean? Well, let's go through the chapters of the Constitution roughly, right? So the values parts, I would say, are really just the opening three parts. The preamble, that part that starts, we, the people of South Africa, recognize the injustices of our past, right? And the preamble, even though it doesn't necessarily have much legal effect, is an attempt to kind of say, this is why this Constitution exists, and this is what this nation is trying to do, right? Then we have what are called the founding provisions. That's chapter 1. And that says that these are the founding values and the founding propositions on which the country is based. So, for example, the supremacy of the Constitution, values of dignity, equality, and freedom. The fact that this is a democracy, it's a republic, and it's a democracy which is a specific kind of democracy with lots of different political parties, common voters' roll, regular elections. Non-racialism and non-sexism. These are the founding values on which the Constitution is built. So you have the preamble, the founding provisions, chapter 1. And in chapter 1, there's also stuff about language. I think this was because when, the Constitution was being negotiated, it was also important not just to make it seem like there was only one language, but in actual fact, that this is a country with many languages. Fam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. Then we have the final part of the value section, which is the Bill of Rights. And you may have heard about this. This is a section which establishes all the rights that you as a citizen of South Africa are entitled to. And again, this is a way of establishing values because it says what the country thinks is important, right? Life and the sanctity of life is important. Therefore, there's a right to life. Freedom of association is important. Your ability to choose whoever you want to associate with, whether that's politically or religiously or anything else. Therefore, we create a right to a freedom of association, right? But remember I said the Constitution only has 14 It has 14 chapters, right? And then there are also schedules after that. I think there are about 7 schedules. So only the first 3 parts, the preamble, chapter 1 and chapter 2, are really about values. And the rest of the Constitution, from chapters 3 all the way to 14, are about the way this government and the way this state is ultimately designed. So what do we mean by that? Think about it. How do we have provinces? How do we have cities? They're not natural creations. Some law has to say there will be 9 provinces and there will be these metropolitan areas. And then there will be a national government. And that national government will have to interact with the provinces in this way and the local government in that way. See how it's very practical and design-oriented. So chapter 3 of the Constitution, which is about cooperative governance, is about the spirit in which the different spheres of government, so that being the local sphere, the city where you live, or the town, or the district municipality, how does that interact with the provincial sphere, like Gauteng or the Western Cape? And then how does that interact with the national sphere? And how do they all mutually cooperate to make sure that at the end of the day, citizens get the goods and the services that they need? So that's a design element. Then chapter 4 is about Parliament, right? The National Assembly. You know, Parliament, the state of the nation, the election of the president, all of that. That comes from the Constitution. How many people will be in Parliament? How does Parliament function? What are the powers of Parliament? What are its responsibilities? How does it scrutinize and oversee the executive or the cabinet? And then the next chapter, which makes sense, is about the executive, the president, the cabinet. How does it relate back to Parliament? And that's chapter 5. So you see how the Constitution is like, we'll tell you the values, but the real meat of the document is how is everything designed in the country and how does the state function? How does the democracy work? There's also a chapter about provinces. So exactly what are the powers of the provinces? Then there's a chapter about the courts and how the courts themselves exercise power, what their power is, the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court of Appeal, the different powers in those different courts. There's a chapter about public administration. Like I said, there's the chapter 9 institutions, which are all about institutions supporting constitutional democracy. The public protector comes from the Constitution. The IEC, which runs elections, comes from the Constitution. The Auditor General. So there are these, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Gender Equality Commission. So there are all these chapter 9 institutions. There's local government, which is chapter 7, which is all about the powers of local government. So where are we? We've done roughly the first 10 chapters and all the design, right? I said chapter 10 is public administration, right? And that's about the civil service and how the civil service functions, what kind of public administration South Africa wants, needs, and deserves, right? So the actual bureaucrats in the government who aren't politicians, who actually have to do the day-to-day work of governing. You also have chapters in the Constitution which are about the security services. Of course, they have a lot of power. So like, what can the police do? What can't they do? What will the security services be able to do? You have chapters about traditional leadership. How much power should traditional leaders have? How much power should they not have? And then finally, chapter 13 is about finances. This is where you get things about the way that revenue will be divided in South Africa and how the public purse has to be looked after. And then finally, there's like a catch-all miscellaneous chapter 14, which is the general provisions of the Constitution. And these are a number of different provisions. Some of them deal with like how international law, should be considered, etc. So, as you can see, the Constitution is actually mainly made up of how the state works. And only the opening parts, which are no less important, are about values. So when people talk about the Constitution, they're often only talking about one little slice of the Constitution, which is sure important, the values. But the real meat and the real substance often is in the design of the state. So when we have a debate about the Constitution and whether it should be kept or scrapped or amended or not, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the whole document, right? And in my view, there are really interesting and important arguments about, if we bracket out the values for a second, how we can remake the design of South Africa so that it becomes more effective and efficient. So for example, if you say to people, do you think we should amend the Constitution? They say, no, never amend the Constitution. Constitution is amazing. And then you're like, okay, do you think the provinces work? They're like, no, I really don't like how the provinces work. Do we even need these provinces? So basically what you're saying then is we should amend the Constitution to fix the provincial system, right? So I think one key question for me in terms of the design of the state and what's not working constitutionally is this three-tiered system of government where you have national government, provincial, and local working? Do they understand all the powers they have? Or is there just a whole lot of confusion in terms of who is supposed to do what, when, and where? And I think a large portion of our service delivery crisis in South Africa is, yes, due to corruption, yes, due to maladministration, but part of it is just due to confusion. Like, is this a national government responsibility, or is this provincial, or is it local? And then each sphere blames the other, and no one actually takes responsibility for what they're supposed to do. So I do think that there are design questions in terms of the multiple spheres of government that need to be looked at. Another area for possible amendment is Parliament itself. Is Parliament appropriately structured? Do we need the National Council of Provinces? Should we have a directly elected upper chamber, like a Senate? Should the electoral system allow for more representation to Parliament of independent candidates, or should it still be this closed party list system where independents have to compete against entire parties? All those kinds of questions have to do with Parliament, its functions. Do debates in Parliament, are they robust enough? Does Parliament have enough power to make sure that the executive is accountable? All of that. I think there are genuine questions there. The president. Is the president too powerful? Is he not powerful enough? Or she? Inshallah, one day. So when you start talking about the Constitution, for me, I'm really interested in, can we update the design of the state in such a way that we learn the lessons of the last 3 decades, but we update just like a piece of technology, or even a person. Like, you constantly have to go through self-recreation, right? Shouldn't we also do that with the Constitution? So that's one thing worth noting, and one thing that I think we need to think about. How do we redesign the South African state to make it more effective and efficient? What are some of the successes of the Constitution? In terms of the values, I think we can't deny that there are really important values that are enshrined in the Constitution that represent dramatic social, political, economic, maybe, gains, right? For example, we take it for granted that we have a democracy where everyone can vote, right? Well, the Constitution did that. Universal adult suffrage. We know in apartheid, black people couldn't vote. So clearly the Constitution is progressive to the extent that it is the document that allows all of us to vote. It's a good thing. It's a great thing. We should keep that. Constitutional supremacy, I think, is cool as well. There are places like the United Kingdom where Parliament is sovereign, and this is something the MK wants to bring in, which I disagree with. So Parliament can do whatever it wants, and as long as Parliament agrees, that becomes law. In our country, we have a constitution which says, hey, Parliament, if you want to do a crazy thing, that has to conform with certain minimum values. Otherwise, it's invalid, right? So in some ways, the Constitution does protect us against the tyranny of Parliament, for example, if Parliament goes crazy one day. I think that's great. I think the rights that are enshrined, obviously the right to life is important and should always be protected. Freedom of association, freedom of religion. I think South Africa is one of the best countries when it comes to tolerance of different religions. Like, there are Jewish South Africans, there are Muslim South Africans, Christian South Africans of no particular faith, Hindu South Africans, Buddhist South Africans, and we all pretty much get along. There are mosques next to synagogues, next to churches. And, there are many countries where religious conflict, can claim lives. In South Africa, we have an open-minded, and we allow you to practice your religion, freely. And that's a really great thing. So I don't think anyone would want to take that away. And that's something the Constitution did, right? There are important, rights, like our Constitution, many, many years ahead of its time, recognized environmental rights and the need to protect the environment. And I think that's a really important thing. So the Constitution has been great. Freedom of expression. This channel would not exist were it not for freedom of expression, right? Because in many countries, you can't say the kinds of things that I say. And our Constitution protects that freedom. So I think it's dishonest of us to suggest that those things aren't really important, right? And the Constitution has to be celebrated for giving us those things, because it's easy to take them for granted, but when they're taken away from you, that's when you really feel them, right? Constitution's also done great things in terms of Section 35 of defending the rights of arrested persons. In apartheid, the government could basically do whatever they wanted. Like, they would throw people in detention for 90 days without trial, like extract confessions through torture and brutality. And at least in theory, the Constitution gives very strong protections to people who are in the custody of the state. And again, you can take it for granted, but if you ever go into the custody of the state, you definitely want those protections, right? So the Constitution has done great things. However, I think there is a tendency to say that the Constitution is unimpeachable, morally unassailable, and there's nothing wrong with the values, right? And here I also push back, because I think that there are certain shortcomings with the Constitution, even from a values perspective. And my main concern, and check out my interview with Prof. Pierre de Vos, constitutional law expert, because we had a really interesting conversation on the Constitution as well. And his views are particularly important. My main concern with the values of the Constitution is that it does not aggressively and boldly enough talk about the need for racial justice. And indeed, justice in general is quite underdeveloped in the document. So there's a lot of talk about freedom, dignity, and equality. But South Africa comes out of a very divided and oppressive past. And in order for the society to transcend that past, we have to have a just society. Those who are left out and who are oppressed and marginalized and subjugated, they have to be able to come into the society and have an equal place in the society. And it's only just that that happens. But the Constitution doesn't really ever make that claim loudly and proudly enough, in my view. And why do I say that? When you look at the preamble, for example, I've discussed this in other videos, I've discussed it in my book, so you can read about my views in more detail there. My book, The New Apartheid. The preamble doesn't really mention colonialism, it doesn't mention apartheid, there's no talk of like racial justice, there's no talk of reparation. There's just these vague references to the injustices of the past. Exactly what they are never spelled out. And so we start from a position where we're not really naming the problem. And then when you come to the founding provisions, like I said, you've got non-racialism. But what is non-racialism? I mean, everyone seems to believe in non-racialism and no one knows what it means. Like the DA thinks they agree. Even the Freedom Front Plus talks about non-racialism. That noble anti-apartheid resistance movement, the Freedom Front Plus, right? I just think non-racialism is too weak, and we should have had a constitution that from the get-go spoke about terms like anti-racism or racial justice and developed a conception of justice of reparation rather than just equality. Because to try and stuff this whole conversation about how we repair society's inequities into a clause about equality just doesn't quite do it. The equality clause, is important, and it gives us substantive equality, and it helps to, protect things like affirmative action and other forms of racial equality. But I just don't think it's explicit enough. And often, and here's my problem with a lot of these, same with the property clause, any attempt to create justice within the Constitution is seen as kind of an offense against a deeper right. So you have this right to equality, but then you can engage in what the Constitution calls positive discrimination. So you can offend against equality by, treating different people slightly differently because they're in a different social position. But what you've done there is you've made justice seem like it's this exception to a deeper norm of equality, when in actual fact, I think we should have had like a racial justice clause. And then, you can create exceptions to that, but that becomes the founding value. Same thing with property. There were long debates about the property clause. I've just recently been reading a biography of Arthur Chaskalson, an important early Chief Justice in South Africa. And you can see even from back then that the property clause was a bone of contention. And again, you have what the Constitution does is it creates a right to property, which is the founding right. And then it creates these exceptions to that right, which could maybe remake property relations. And there's a big debate about whether they do. But I have just a problem with the structure of that, right? I think we should have had like a right to land or a right to land justice. And then maybe the exceptions to that could have told us how, people won't arbitrarily be deprived of property. So I do think the Constitution is a little timid in the way it goes about declaring reparatory justice, particularly racial justice. And I would even say there are forms of gender justice that the Constitution could have been more ambitious about. Fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. So there we go. That's an attempt to give a nuanced critique of the Constitution, to say that there are things that I'm triumphalist about, there are things that I'm abolitionist about, and there are things that I'm skeptical about. Maybe to come onto the skeptical side of the equation, there are certain things in the Constitution where I'm like, that's pretty good, but it's also not the best thing in the world, right? So for example, the socio-economic rights. There are some really good things about that, right? Like, so these are rights where it's like people have the right to water, people have the right to medical care, people have the right to social security, right? And these rights are around rights 24 to 28 in the Constitution, right? Chapter 2, Bill of Rights. And this is great, okay? We're giving people a right to water. That's wonderful. But at the same time, I'm like, is that all we could really do? Like, at the end of the day, these are basic necessities of life, right? So, yes, well done. We said that people should have a right to water, but that's not a particularly ambitious thing in the context of South Africa, right? It's not like other constitutions like the Indian constitution or the Brazilian constitution, which actually say like certain redistributions of wealth are just so grotesque that they shouldn't be allowed to happen. The Indian constitution has these amazing passages about economic inequality and how there should never be so much economic inequality that it offends the public good. And I feel like in addition to socioeconomic rights, which are important and which are great, we could have gone even further given how unequal our society is. there was a need to go even further and say, well, it's not just about giving people water and, minimum healthcare and education. Of course, we need to give those things and we should keep them. But we should have maybe had an even vaster and more ambitious conception of economic type rights. And that's another kind of silence in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't really say, anything about economic inequality or economic injustice. It's all implied. And yes, constitutional jurisprudence, which I won't get into in this particular video because it's about the constitutional text. Jurisprudence is like case law, which interprets the Constitution. Yes, judges have done some creative things to try and expand rights and to talk about inequality and Ubuntu and all these kinds of things. But the text, let me put it this way, I think it can still go further. And I think we can entertain talk about amendments to the Constitution, which would take us a step further. Will that change South Africa? No, because constitutions don't change things in and of themselves. But they can create a permissive environment in which the government and society has more flexibility and scope to attack the injustices of the present, not just the past, so that they don't become injustices of the future. So, let me conclude. This has just been an attempt to say, look, there's this big debate going on in the country about the Constitution. How can I help you and how can we collectively come together to deepen this debate and think about it from lots of different perspectives, right? Because there's a tendency to just demonize people on either side, right? There are people on one side of the debate who say, oh, well, if you criticize the Constitution, you're an anti-constitutionalist and you have authoritarian motives and you just want to be corrupt, and that's why you want to change the Constitution so you can be corrupt. And that's a very unhelpful way of having the debate, right? Because there is a genuine position, which has been elaborated by various scholars who I've mentioned Dando Sindane, Professor Tsepo Madlingozi, people like Joel Mudiri, Professor Joel Mudiri. There are lots of interesting scholars, who really paint a nuanced picture of what's wrong with the Constitution. And it's unfair to just lump everyone together because you don't like what MK said about parliamentary sovereignty, right? I also disagree with that proposal. But the fact is that MK is tapping into a certain sentiment in society which may not have been articulated in the way that I did it, but is very legitimate and real, where people are disappointed with the constitutional democracy as it stands. At the same time, there is a tendency to also villainize or vilify people who are triumphalists, who say, oh, you're naive, you're just doing it to protect your vested interests, you don't really care about racial justice and all of that. So we should also not attack. There are people who genuinely believe this Constitution is the best thing we can achieve, and that's okay. We need to just have the debate in a calm and measured way about, what could be right, what could be wrong. A lot of what I have said could just be wrong, and that's fine. I'm always willing to entertain people who have a different view and justify their view, and I think that's how we ultimately deepen the debate. And maybe I look at that and I say, maybe they're right there, and maybe they listen to my position and say, okay, maybe there's a grain of truth in what he's saying too. There's an interesting story at the end of this that I want to also caution about, which is about Chile, the Latin American democracy. Now, they had a dictatorship under a dictator called Pinochet for a long time. And even though the dictatorship ended and Chile became a democracy, they still have the old constitution that was the constitution under which the dictator ruled. And they've had a long debate in Chile about should they change that old constitution, right? And this new young president came in and started and initiated this whole, it was like a 3-year-long process where they went around the country, they created a new constitutional convention, they created a new draft of the Chilean constitution. And they needed to get 50% of the Chilean people to agree on this new text. And you know what happened? They couldn't agree. So we must also always remember that it's nice to talk about constitutions in theory, but constitutions also always have to have the support of the governed. So we might have this perfect constitution in our minds, But would that be able to unite society around it so that society would agree to those amendments? The Chilean story is a cautionary one because it's got to the point now. So they didn't agree on the first draft. They went back and redrafted a second draft of the constitution, put it to the people again, and they couldn't get consensus again. So guess what? Chile is now back to the old constitution that everyone agreed needs to change because no one can agree on how it needs to change. So there is a further maybe conversation in South Africa that we need to have about the practicalities of constitutional change. We can have theoretical debates, which maybe I have been having about what should change and what shouldn't, but constitutions are always the product of political compromise, and in some ways they have to be consensus documents. Otherwise, people just undermine them and their legitimacy is called into question. So the Chilean story is maybe a cautionary tale about how hard it is to really remake constitutions. But on the other hand, there have been moments throughout history where nations have taken a look at themselves and said, you know what, we need to reform. And I do think that there is an interesting and a creative opportunity for constitutional reform in South Africa today. That does not mean that I hate the Constitution, nor does it mean that I completely love everything about it. I think you can have a good conversation about remaking the Constitution while you understand that you are bound by the current Constitution. And that's what democracy is all about. So, I hope this has helped you navigate and understand the constitutional debate in South Africa. Like, share, subscribe. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers by the end of this year. Let me know your thoughts. We have a thriving comment section down below, which is even better than reading the opinion section in a newspaper these days. So I look forward to engaging with you down there. Share your thoughts on the Constitution. Aye.